And welcome everyone to DRJ's webinar series. I am Bob Arnold with Disaster Recovery Journal. Today's sponsor is Everbridge, and today we'll be discussing building a business case for organizational resilience. Before we get started, I want to review a couple housekeeping items. Today's session is being recorded. This recording will be shared with everyone tomorrow via an automated email. Attendees are also in a listen-only mode. If you'd like to ask any questions, please use the question panel you will locate on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll answer as many of these questions as possible at the end of the session. And now back to today's topic on building a business case for organizational resilience. Our presenter today is Sean McDevitt. Sean is the Director of CEM Solutions for Everbridge, where he helps lead product and go-to-market strategy. He has held various leadership positions in the SaaS industry for the last 10 plus years. He lives in Atlanta, Georgia with his wife Melanie and their two dogs, Shankly and Finley. And with no further introduction, I'd like to now welcome and turn the mic over to Sean.
Thank you, Bob. Sincerely appreciate that introduction. It's great to be with the audience again today. I hope that some of you were able to join us, what I guess was a couple of weeks ago at this point, for our discussion on hybrid work. Today, like Bob mentioned, we're going to be covering building a business case for organizational resilience, which will kind of go in a variety of different directions, everything from consensus building to the types of events that we should be listening for and how we can react to them, as well as a couple other areas. I really look forward to being able to share some of this information with everyone today. As we go through this, let's actually take a quick peek at what we're going to talk about, right? Our impact, our first thing we'll talk about is the impact of understanding operational costs of incident response. The second thing we'll focus on will be value, configuring a business value impact, and then finally comparing ourselves and evaluating your organization and your strategic initiatives against SOPs and your SOPs against market leaders and global trends. As Bob did a nice introduction to myself, and do just a couple of brief things. I won't stay on here for too long. As Bob mentioned, Sean McDevitt, Director of CEM Solutions. I'm in Atlanta, Georgia. Been with Everbridge since 2019, kind of floated around from a variety of SaaS companies over the last 10 years. You can see where I've spent some time in the bottom left there. I donate other parts of my time when I'm not working to the Golden Retriever Rescue of Atlanta. I'm a member of ASIS in Atlanta. And I grew up speaking the security language. My father was a director of loss prevention for a variety of different organizations for about 40 years and just recently retired. So I've had many a dinner table conversation revolving around some of the subjects that we're going to talk about today. So let's actually go ahead and get started. What does the impact look like for organizational resilience, particularly the bottom line, right? If we're not as resilient as we would like to be, what are the impacts that we could actually interact with? So let's find some common ground to start off with. There's actually a specific definition for organizational resilience coming out of the UK. It's the ability of an organization to anticipate, prepare for, respond, and adapt to incremental change and sudden disruptions in order to survive and prosper. Right, so pretty generic, but I'm sure you can automatically think about some of those types of things that you've had to respond to over the last several years, right? COVID obviously being the biggest, but there's going to be other smaller ones that are going to come up that you have to respond to and be able to adapt to in an agile way throughout that process. Some of those things that we might be listening for or might be reacting to: wildfires, active shooters, IT disruptions, terrorist attacks, or even weather, right? All of those are different things that we may face that could cause our organization to have some type of disruption and cause a financial impact, right? From a study we did about 18 months ago here at Everbridge, we asked organizations what types of things they had to interact with, what types of times have they launched a crisis response plan. And 33% of the time, or 33% of the respondents had actually had to deal with some type of extreme weather, natural disaster, right? 28% theft of intellectual property or physical property, all the way down to active shooters at 11%, right? So each one of these are going to have their own impacts, their own responses. But the idea here is that we're facing a wide variety of different things that we're going to have to adjust to. And we're going to need to be able to find a way to make our organization resilient in order to respond to that. Now, each one of these results are going to have a variety of different landscapes that they start to impact, right? If we go from the widest margin, we can say a region, or regionality, natural disasters, inclement weather, political turmoil that can impact a region, a country, a state, a province. We can look at transportation disruptions, which kind of end up looking at state and province, county, cities, all the way down to the farthest right, where we truly look at something that's internal to just us in most cases, right? An application outage, ransomware. But the idea here is that we have to focus on how we respond, and how we respond to each one of these is going to be a little bit different based on what the threat landscape looks like, right? What's being impacted, how many different sites, how many different business units, how many different employees are going to be impacted based on this particular component. So when do we actually need to act? We need to act when we have our assets that have been impacted, right? So we start to look at our assets, and those can be people, places, things that we care about. They might be reputational in nature. They might be infrastructure. They might be supply chain. They might be our actual employees or travelers that are out in the business or out in the field, and how those interact with risk events themselves. Those risk events are going to be those things that we just talked about. And when those two things come together is when we see what we call as a critical event, right? That's going to force us to come into a response and say, all right, when these two things come together, bad things that are happening around the world are interacting with the things that I care about or the things that could cause a disruption to my business, that's when I need to start to take action. So what are the financial impacts when I need to take action or on some of these events around the world? In 2018, the total cost to businesses in terms of lost productivity or lost revenue was $220 billion. Well, a few things have happened since then, COVID being the biggest one, and that's only going to continue to grow, right? There are studies out now that are putting that number somewhere in the low trillions, based off of just COVID impact alone, right? But the idea here is that we're going to continue to see this number grow over time, regardless of black swan events, which will probably come about again, but they may not be as dramatic as COVID. But this number is still going to continue to grow. So we need to understand, all right, how is our organization going to be impacted? What is that financial impact really going to look like? But there are even pieces that go beyond just raw financials, right? There are other components that we may face that can be impacted, right? Nearly 60% of critical events resulted in severe impacts on customer or employee safety. So obviously, when we have employees or customers that are impacted that are possibly going to be injured, not be able to work, whatever that situation is, we need to be able to say, all right, how can I get them back up and running, or just keep them safe at the most basic level? We also can start to look at brand and reputation damage, right? 56% of organizations suffered some form of brand or reputation damage because they weren't able to respond to a critical event in the appropriate way, whether that be they weren't able to get information or data out to their customers or product out to their customers, or their competitors did it better than they were. So when it actually comes to responding to these events, we have to think about the actions that we take. So Newton's third law, for those of you that haven't taken physics AP in the several years, just like myself, is the idea that for every action, there's an equal or opposite reaction. And so when something happens, we can assume that we're operating at optimal conditions. And when we're operating at optimal conditions, things are going well, obviously. But when an incident occurs, interruption begins, and we start to move away from those optimal conditions, right? Our productivity is down, our revenue might be shrinking, our market share might be shrinking, whatever it is. We aren't typically aware of the event that has occurred at the moment. There's at least some amount of lag where we have to become aware of the risk event that's taken place, whether that be a ransomware or a terrorist attack or whatever, right? When we think back to that threat landscape, it's not immediate and oftentimes. And then after that, we decide what action needs to be taken in order to mitigate it. So we've decided that we need to issue a crisis response plan. We need to communicate with our employees. We need to find a new supplier, a new vendor. We need to make sure that our employees are traveling to safe locations. Whatever that step is, we begin to take it, and we're hoping that that's going to mitigate what's taken place. But even then, it's not instantaneous. And I think a lot of organizations overlook that, right? Oh, I took the action, we're back up and running. That's, again, not usually the case. There's still going to be time where we're moving away from optimal conditions. And as we move away from optimal conditions, eventually the event stabilizes and then the recovery begins. So it takes time for these things to begin to work themselves out, even when we take action. So as this progresses, we end up at step 5 where we recover to optimal conditions. But even when we do that, there's still a gap between where we were and where we are now. So every time we have to take action, every time an incident influences the organization, there's a certain amount of lost productivity, lost revenue that we're going to incur. So how do we shorten that gap or make that gap smaller? Well, technology can help. That can be one component of it. It doesn't have to be the only component, right? We might decide that we need to employ more individuals to do this, that, or the other thing. But technology can help. And if we think back to those steps, right? The first was just becoming aware, right? Know what's happening or what may happen. So if I can figure out a way to deploy technology that helps me become more aware more quickly, then we're going to shorten that gap, right? Locate, determine what's being impacted, right? We need to understand who, what, when, all those different components. And then we're going to figure out that act that we want to take, right? Again, is that launching a communication to employees? Is that launching a crisis management plan? Is that communicating out with vendors, business units, customers, whatever that action plan is? And then finally, when we start to return to that recovery to optimize to optimal conditions, we'll start to analyze that performance. So overall, we can go back and say, all right, this is how we performed. And these are types of things that are going to happen, dozens, hundreds, thousands of times a year, depending on the global scale of your organization and the types of things that can impact you. So technology can help here. It is not the cure-all. I am not going to claim that it is a cure-all, but it can help as we go through this process and think about that gap between when something takes place, when we learn about it, when we act on it, and when recovery truly starts to begin. So let's start to talk about value a little bit. So when we start to think about value, we'll configure our business value impact in a couple different ways. I think oftentimes, for better or for worse, security organizations and to some extent IT organizations are viewed as a cost center, right? They're viewed as the last line of defense when a situation occurs, right? They're the goalie in this particular case. There's been something bad that's happening. We're gonna, hope that they're able to dive in front of it, take one for the team, and stop whatever's taking place. But I think that's a very 20th century look at both IT operations and security operations. If we are organizationally resilient, we are going to be able to turn what used to be the last line of defense into the first line of offense. It now starts with IT operations, security operations. If we're organizationally resilient, we are aware before others. We're able to help take action before others. And when I say others, I don't mean internally, I mean our competitors. I mean our vendors, so that we can then be saying to them, hey, this is coming, this has happened, did you know about this? So turning it in from the last line of defense to the last line of defense to the first line of offense is huge, right? Setting up those other departments to be successful. And I think if we can reframe that conversation internally to say, hey, this is how I can help you. The prime example that I think about the most is supply chain and the disruptions that we've seen organizations have over the last, what I guess is approaching 30 months because of COVID. If they can help them find those different ways of saying, all right, this is how we can respond to this a little bit faster than some other areas, this is really turning something away from a cost center and into a revenue generating part of the team. So part of the way that we can reframe that conversation is how we talk about it internally. There's a gentleman by the name of Simon Sinek who's done a variety of TED Talks and written some books, and I want to talk about his philosophy here. The idea is, how do we traditionally sell? And he's always used it in more of an externally focused model. I think it applies to an internally focused model as well. So generally what we talk about when we're going to either we're going to buy a car from somebody, or we're trying to build consensus for a new project that we want to deploy internally, we start with what? We tell them what we want to do. And then we go to how we're going to do it. Right? So I'm told you, hey, we want to protect our travelers. I want to go out and buy a technology that does TRM, travel risk management, and I think that this is the best solution to keep those people safe. Doesn't really inspire a lot of people to action. So that last piece that we end up seeing is the why, right? And I think that oftentimes individuals, myself included, are too late to getting to the why, right? I think when we're trying to build consensus, or when we're trying to sell something internally, we should more often start with the why. Why is that TRM important? And it's not that I want to, preserve revenue or all those different things. There's a bigger area as a security organization of why we do these things, right? And part of it is turning that last line of defense into that first line of offense. And some of it can be very rudimentary, just saying, I want to keep people safe. But there's oftentimes, if we can lead the why with those individuals that we're talking to, that will really help us sell this internally. So when we start with the why, we'll talk about there's a lot of increased danger within the world right now. We want to be able to keep people safe. If we can keep people safe and moving in and out of countries in a programmatic way, they'll be able to stay working longer, and they'll be able to bill more hours. Could be an example. So more billable hours ends up being the answer. How are we going to do that? We're going to deploy a TRM that will help keep those employees safe, and will connect to our travel booking software, right? And then that final what is, we're going to keep those people safe. So reframing how we approach that conversation and starting with why will more oftentimes lead people to buying into the project that we're trying to deploy. And that value of why can kind of come in multiple levels. So the first is typically cost avoidance, right? I want to avoid any type of disruption that we can have that would cost us money, right? Protecting people, which is basically foundational, right? The opportunity there is just cost containment. If my people end up trapped in a country, if my people end up injured, if my people or offices end up not being able to be functional, I'm going to have an increased cost there, right? So that's the base layer of my value behind why. The next step is going to say, all right, well, I want to ensure operations. If I can ensure operations through business continuity, the opportunity for me there is really preserving my revenue. So if I can make sure that we're maintaining that status quo, I'm going to make sure that we're not going to have any type of dip in revenue. Another layer to that why. And then finally, the kind of the end pyramid is optimize that performance. So we can create competitive advantage, which is really about just managing the risk better than our competitors. And so the opportunity ends up being ensuring some form of revenue growth, right? That might be more market share. It might mean that we have more customers convert to us, right? There's going to be a variety of different ways that we can achieve that. But when it comes to truly being risk resilient, we're optimizing that performance and are now going to be able to take advantage of some of those other components. So there are some different examples of what those things look like. So if I start to identify my business goals in aligning to this value pyramid, I could say again, that first one is reducing the costs, right? Reduce costs by consolidating into a single platform, right? Breaking down data silos, coming together in a single platform so that we're all operating off the same thing. We can avoid our losses, right? We're not going to respond, or if we do that, we're not responding appropriately to threats that can result in damage or losses, fines, high insurance, legal expenses, all those different components, right? So let's avoid those. I can perhaps have an opportunity to increase my customer loyalty, thereby preserving my revenue. right? If I don't respond to those threats appropriately, customer confidence, could cause them to go somewhere else. So it's an opportunity to preserve my revenue. I can avoid other disruptions that can cost thousands of minutes per downtime. If I've got supply chain things that are locked in the Suez Canal during a blockage, right? All of that can cost me money, and I can avoid those disruptions. I can support corporate initiatives, right? So better risk resiliency can help support corporate growth initiatives like entering new markets, right? If I am aware of what's taking place and I have an organization that's resilient, I know what's happening around the globe. They can come to me, they can say, what is this security risk look like? What is the risk of entering this emerging market? What are the things that we need to be thinking about that could impact us? And then the final piece, just growing revenues. Risk resiliency can become a competitive advantage, allowing you to gain market share from your competitors. Again, if I can respond more quickly than my competitors to a given situation, it's giving me an opportunity to capitalize. And I think that oftentimes organizations are more focused on the bottom red ones than they are on the green ones. There really is an opportunity for us to go out there and grow revenue by deploying an organization that has a unified critical event management approach. So let's look at a couple different examples of how this might actually work. So again, baseline of this, keeping people safe, right? Protect people and assets. Well, if I get these things wrong, this is what ends up happening, right? Protests put my employees and assets at risk. At the most basic of level, that's what I need to avoid. The next level up, protests at my facility cause work stoppages and lost productivity. If I'm unable to ensure operations, that is the fallback that I'm going to end up seeing. And then optimizing performance. If I'm not truly risk resilient, my stock might take a hit, my brand might take a hit in terms of brand satisfaction. If I look at it from a terrorist perspective or a terrorism perspective, right? Again, putting my employees at risk costs extra dollars if I have to do extraction fees out of a particular country. I want to ensure my operations. If I don't do that, I'm delaying travelers and impacting productivity. And then if I'm not risk resilient, I may have to avoid doing business in specific areas. And then severe weather. Delayed response results in losses to damaged assets. If I don't help my people on the ground know what's coming and what they need to be doing in order to prepare for severe weather, I may suffer from that. From a business continuity perspective, if I need to ensure my operations, unnecessary shutdowns results in lost revenues, right? If I have to shut a plant down because I didn't have this process aligned, I'm going to suffer those types of consequences. And then risk resilient, lost market share because competitors are now taking advantage of me. So if we go back to the golden circle, which we talked about just a moment ago, right? We talked about how you start with the why, you go to the how, and then you finally end up at what. I do think, particularly when looking at this internally, we need to also add an additional layer. I think that when I'm selling internally, I also want to consider the who, right? I need to know who I'm selling to and what's important to them, right? What part of this have they been struggling with? What are the areas that they have not been able to find organizational resilience within their own department, and that I, as a security operations leader, can help drive them towards? If I can help drive them towards that, obviously, I'm going to now be able to deploy the program and the project that I'm looking to get to. And when I try to find that who, if I think about a CEM mission, right, we're going to have a variety of business stakeholders that we might want to partner with. When we start to partner with corporate security or IT operations or field operations, each one of them has their own unique needs on what their business initiatives or objectives are and what they've been tasked with. So working with fellow counterparts, department heads, whatever that ends up being, and saying, what are you trying to do? What can I help with? And I've really seen an increase of this in the last 24 months, right? When COVID came about, suddenly HR and security and facility operations were working much more closely together than they ever had before, because they knew neither one of them or none of them really had the technology to handle every piece of that. They knew that they needed to lean on someone else at some point in order to help that process. And I think that that's opened up some eyes and some opportunities for organizations to continue those talks, to say, all right, we did this with COVID. How else can we work together towards a unified CEM mission or a unified CEM approach? I think it's also important to tell the right story. I think that we've talked a little bit about how we can position value through storytelling and what's the possible outcome. But I know that when you're traditionally selling to, supply chain or IT operations, those are going to be very evidence-based buyers. So when we're telling the right story, we want to think about telling anecdotes versus supplying evidence, right? We want to say, is this a data-heavy conversation, or is this something where I'm trying to paint a picture of the art of the possible? Sometimes it's a combination of both. Sometimes it's one or the other, right? And we need to be thinking about the story that we tell to that respective audience. And when we start to tell this story, we can dive deeper into the actual evidence-based theory. Again, we've talked a lot about so far, what is the story we're going to tell? What are the possible value propositions that we want to put out there, right? Some of those are much more anecdotal. Well, when it comes to the evidence, we can break this down very specifically, like we saw on the slide before where we were looking at that optimization gap. We can actually run tabletop exercises and say, all right, how long does it take us to do these types of things today, right? Our current process, it takes us 20 minutes to fully access and contextualize when an event takes place. Right? It takes us another 20 minutes to actually, for the SOC to correlate what's been impacted. And then after an hour, roughly an hour, we'll start to communicate out with those stakeholders who might be impacted on the ground, or might be business unit leaders, or might be executive leadership, right? But we've started to communicate out. And then after about 2.5 hours, we'll officially mark this event as over. If we've started to communicate with the people who've received all those communications back, that they say that they're okay, or that they've taken the action needed that we recommended. Well, we can also look at this from a unified CEM benchmark. We can either go out to a variety of consulting groups. We can look at industry papers and say, all right, what are industry leaders doing? Or you can run pilots, projects, and say, all right, this is how we could improve upon this by using a specific software or a specific set of tools or hiring more people. And so when we start to condense that, we end up breaking it down into what was our mean time to know versus current process versus unified, mean time to act, mean time to communicate. And those numbers that we see on the right side of the screen, 50%, 72%, and 66%, are the benchmarks that we've seen on average at Everbridge when organizations start to take a more unified approach, right? If I'm using one tool for risk intel, one tool for employee travel, one tool for employee communication, right? What can happen if we start to bring all those things together? And if we look at it this way, we can actually start to tie dollar values back to it, right? We can now look at a financial impact when something takes place. Because if I know how long it took me before, how long it takes me after, I also know how much my employees' time is worth, how much it costs me every time a data center goes down, how much it costs me every time an application goes down. All of those have actual dollar values tied to them. Now, I am by no means going to say that there's nearly a $6 million return on investment for absolutely every organization. It might be smaller, it might be larger, but it's going to be completely dependent upon you. But there are ways of breaking this down so that when we go to talk about this internally and we have something that we're trying to achieve through organizational resilience, we can provide the evidence necessary to those specific buyers and say, this is what we're looking at if we can increase this, right? And you might say, I might not get to 20 minutes to 2 minutes, right? I might only go from 20 to 15 or 20 to 10 when it comes to understanding who's been impacted during that locate phase. That's okay, but we're still going to see an incremental improvement and be able to tie a dollar value back to it. So let's go to the last stage here, which is really comparing ourselves to other organizations that are out there in global trends and leaders. There's always going to be a maturity to a unified approach or towards organizational resilience, right? When we think about it from an ad hoc perspective, typically uncoordinated, unstructured, very paper heavy, right? We're going to work our way through reactive, which is CEM, is considered a cost center. We talked about that before. Basic process are followed, right? We'll practice this. We know what we're going to do when this type of thing happens. Manage means it's important, CM is important and helps reduce the risk. We've got organizational buy-in at this point. We've started to acknowledge that there is a reason to invest here. Proactive, the best practices are sought after. We're starting to become that bleeding edge. And then optimize is really considered a differentiator, right? That's where we're getting to that first line of offense. And that's truly world-class once we reach that level. But we can dive a little bit deeper into each one of these and start to understand where does our organization fit today, right? So an ad hoc organization typically have simple protocols in place to meet common safety guidelines and daily operations to make sure they're continued run. These organizations are almost completely dependent upon news channels, National Weather Service, things like that. And we don't really have an organized approach across departments when things take place, right? One department is going to have their crisis management plan. Another department's going to have their crisis management plan. They're not really talking together. It's extremely siloed. When it comes to reactive, we are starting to work more together, right? They have response plans and protocols to reduce the overall impact. They may be across those departments in order to make sure that we're all rowing in the same direction. Their ability to quickly help individuals in harm's way and restore operations can be hindered at times by their ability to identify threats on who is actually impacted, right? I have this data coming in, I don't know who's impacted, right? Which again, who's impacted could be a building, a person, a supply chain, a vendor, all those different things. And I might need to take different steps when that takes place. And that's where we'll start to get to managed, right? We're going to see that these organizations are evaluating this. They're proficient in discovering those threats, determining what their operations need to be. They're capable of deploying different response teams to different situations, and they're able to correct those weaknesses. They understand where they're getting things wrong. Most organizations don't know, if they're on those first two phases, don't know what they don't know, right? They just keep plowing ahead instead of stepping back and having the ability to say, all right, this is where we're at. This is how we can do better. But we're still not necessarily proactive at step 3. When we want to become proactive, we're learning to automate more and more, right? We're going to start to allow different tools to tell us when it's time to act, whether those be travel risk management solutions, risk intel solutions, employee communication solutions. All of those different things are going to have automation tools built into them that are going to help us say, this is when we need to take action based off of the workflows and rules that we've determined affect our organization. So if we can start rallying the troops and say, all right, it's told us that it's time to act based off of these series of inputs, now we're really getting towards that bleeding edge. And then that final piece is going to be that optimization. Optimized organizations leverage that full unified approach, right? They're going to have a centralized team. You're going to be a global organization. You're going to work in coordination with everything from facilities, supply chain, IT. You're going to have a variety of internal resources, technology, and automation in order to achieve a unified approach. Now, these don't operate on their own, right? You don't just simply take one step and go from ad hoc to reactive. There are different things that you can do in each area that we've talked about to kind of progress down that path, right? And some of those ones that we've identified might be risk identification, right? We'll take the top one. If you're manually identifying any type of risk that occurs, right, by watching the news or looking at a raw feed, I can take the step to say, all right, I've identified it. How can I start to automate that and correlate it to my assets? Is there a tool out there? Are there people out there that can help me say, when this happens, this is what's impacted, right? Operational response. Can I move from a paper-based to something that's more automated, something that's more digital? When it comes to reporting and analytics, right? Can I think about how I can report on this? What do I have access to? What data silos do I need to break down? How can I make this auditable and automated so that when something happens, it's going to tell me how I'm performing? And then finally, kind of the breadth of the overall benefit is going to go from departmental, right? It's going to have IT's own operations and HR's own operations and communications and all those different areas and securities operations to something that's much more enterprise-wide. I understand that that's a very difficult thing to do. And I think that that's, what a lot of organizations struggle with is they can do these other incremental pieces, but finding a way to have a cohesive playbook that spans those departments is very difficult. And that's where we need that buy-in from all the different parts of the organization. But there are some follow-on effects here, right? A unified approach to CEM greatly improves outcomes of customer safety, that's not surprising, employee safety, not surprising, and executive protection and VIP safety. But when we listened to organizations, what they said was, when we improved this, we also had a flow-on effect of brand and reputation improvements and revenue. Now, in a previous life, I worked for an organization that did customer experience. And brand and reputation, whether I'm looking at CSAT scores, NPS scores, for every percent those go up, there is a direct effect on the bottom line. So if I am able to respond quickly to a given event and keep my operations running and subsequently keep my customers happy, and I have an increase in brand and reputational performance, I'm going to see a direct impact on that bottom line. If my customers are surprised that I was able to get them the running shoes that they ordered in the middle of a hurricane, they are becoming a customer for life, and our NPS score is going up, or our CSAT score goes up, and we're going to see an overall increase in our revenue. Those two things are tied directly together, and I don't think a lot of organizations understand that that unified approach leads directly to those. I do understand as well, and I'm sure Bob would agree with this, that this is not something that takes place overnight. I get that, right? Today, we're evaluating risk intelligence from a variety of different sources, right? We're bringing that data in, we're trying to understand what's happening around the world and how we can react to it. Next quarter, we want to correlate risk intel against travel or itineraries, right? We talked about that travel risk management piece just a little while ago. We want to increase that. That's our next step. We're setting these goals for ourselves. Next year, we want to digitize our business continuity playbooks. In the future, we want to utilize historic risk events to instruct supply chain business decisions, right? Really starting to get to that optimized focus, but the end game is always going to be operational resilience. Now, that's a moving target. If I were to say that if you do these 4 things, you will be operationally resilient, that would be dishonest, right? It is going to be a moving target for years to come, right? There are going to be, as we mentioned before, more black swan events. There are going to be, hopefully not quite as bad, more COVID-like events where we're going to have to determine what do we do as an organization to take steps to mitigate this and determine what our new vantage point of what operational resilience really looks like. Under these guidelines, what does this really mean? And I think it's important to note that when we think about that moving target, we have to have an agile attitude and agile platforms that support that. Where organizations get stuck, particularly between steps 4 and 5, which were proactive into optimized, is the inability to improvise when a situation takes place, right? We can practice and we can practice and we can practice and we can practice. But if I don't have tools and individuals with the critical thinking that they've applied to this that allows for them to improvise in the moment, I'm never going to be fully optimized. We have to be able to say, all right, when this happens, let's shift gears. Let's be willing to look in a different direction and look at this problem from a different vantage point. And I think that that's where organizations can get stuck, especially when they're trying to get to that fully optimized piece. Couple things here just to wrap up. I do oftentimes want to talk about security awareness and training because I think this is a great way to start to get people to think about the why behind what's important, right? If you joined us a couple weeks ago for the hybrid model, I brought this up, but we oftentimes have to sit there and do IT security training, right? I know a lot of organizations, if not all, have to do the phishing things in terms of IT operations, right? Looking for those suspicious emails. What are those different things that we need to do as an IT organization to make sure that we're staying safe and not opening ourselves up to risk? We need to be including, as security leaders, we need to be advocating for these to be included in those yearly annual trainings. If we can get people to understand and see these things on a more regular basis so that the first time they start to think about it isn't when the event has happened, we will be doing ourselves a giant favor when it comes to telling these stories, sharing these evidence, and trying to build consensus in the future. Getting them thinking about these things early and often is the best way to start to get some form of adoption. Not saying that means they're going to give you a blank check the moment we do this, but it is going to help you lay that foundational groundwork. Just some closing thoughts here. When we start to think about the things that we covered, we wanted to understand the costs of action and in some cases inaction, right? If we don't take action immediately, we're moving further and further away from optimal conditions. This is going to require an agile approach. We have to think about what's happening, what tools we're using, what people we're working with, all those different components. We'll listen to that last to first argument, talking about how we can no longer be viewed as a cost center and should try to be viewed as the first line of offense for the organization, how we can go from just avoiding costs to generating revenue. Partnerships are going to be essential for this execution. There is no denying that. There are very few security organizations out there who are just told, go buy what you want, it's fine. We have to find partnerships in other business units and other departments that are going to help us sell this internally. Right? What are they struggling with today that I can help them address? Finding those internal stakeholders, telling the story of why first, using that golden circle example to say, this is why we're going to do something, this is how we're going to do something, this is what we're going to do. I'm telling you, if you embrace that model, you will have a much more receptive audience at the end of that meeting. And then finally, finding those benchmarks. Who do we compare ourselves against? What do those benchmarks look like internally? And how do we improve upon them? It is not good enough to just sit back and say, this is what we did right. We have to evaluate what we were doing wrong. That's sometimes a difficult conversation to have. I fully get that. But it's what makes good organizations become great, is the willingness to look back and say, this is where we missed. It's not always about patting ourselves on the back and saying, okay, these are the things that we do well. Let's improve upon those, right? We're already super good at this. Let's make it that 1% better. If we focus on the areas where we're struggling, we'll be able to make leaps and bounds, not 1%, right? We're going to increase this by 50%, 70%. And if we can focus on that and find those benchmarks where we can make a true impact, it will really lead us towards organizational resilience. So I know we have about 15 minutes left or so. I just wanted to take a breath, see if there were questions that came in, Bob. If Bob, you have questions you wanted to ask, that's always an option as well. But yeah, just take a breath and see where we're at.
Wonderful. Thanks, Sean. Thanks for sharing some great information here with us today. There are a few questions that have come in already, but also if you do have any questions for Sean, again, you can locate the question panel on the right-hand side of your screen. You can also always reach out to Sean with his contact information there on the screen. So first question, When reaching out to counterparts within my organization, is there somewhere you have seen most organizations start?
Um, I would imagine that my answer to this question pre-2020 would have been different. I think it probably would have started with HR first, pre-2020. I just think that employee safety, duty of care, those strategic initiatives often obviously align with what security has been tasked with. Not to say that that's not still the case, but I will say that the organizations that I've seen really start to try to push some of these initiatives and increase their organizational resilience go to operations. Whether that be just pure operations or supply chain operations, that is without question where I see most of the connections being made internally to those organizations. The number of conversations that I'm getting brought into now with senior directors of supply chain or just supply chain and warehouse and things like that have increased, I don't know, 50-fold probably. And it seems that those departments have been struggling for a while. They've been getting by with what they have, but they're looking for a partner in almost every case. They're looking for someone, security, whoever, to help them navigate these waters. They're very good at the logistics. They're not necessarily up to speed on what the world of risk intel looks like and emergency communications and things. So that would be, if you have a group like that, I would say start there, and if not, HR is the most common partner as well.
All right, next question. You shared some pretty in-depth financial analysis. Who do you work with to help constructing something like this?
Yeah, I think that answer can vary. I hate to be a little bit gray there, but I think that answer can vary. And so in some cases, organizations have that level of insight already, and it's about digging into it and putting it into a format that is perhaps more digestible to a wider audience. In other cases, I think that there obviously are consulting groups out there that can help you identify some of those things. Some of it's already out there and publicly accessible, right? I know Forrester has done a variety of studies like that to kind of talk about what are the benchmarks they see across different industries, which you can then parlay into, all right, this is what they're saying in terms of our industry, but can I apply some of those metrics directly to our business and input some of our information? I think that that's probably where I would start if we haven't tackled these types of things before. I mean, if you have budget, if you're ready to go out there, finding a consulting group, whether it be, McKinsey, Atos, whoever, Gartner in some cases, you could go out there and do that. But I think that a lot of times just starting with some of the publicly facing information, particularly at Forrester, I've found to be very helpful.
All right, another getting started question here. Before I start this project, I want to rally my teammates or direct reports around the idea of organizational resilience. Do you have any good places to start?
Yeah, so that's a great question, right? Sometimes we need to sell to the guy or the girl sitting right next to us, and we don't necessarily always know that, right? Our teammates may not always be on the exact same page that we are to start off with, and we have grandiose visions of getting the entire organization on board, and we don't necessarily even have, like I said, the guy or girl sitting next to us on board yet. There's a couple articles, the ones that I've found to be most impactful, I guess, or interesting have been on the Harvard Business Review. I'll actually put one in the chat that I thought was particularly interesting. Part of it being that I'm a big fan of Alex Honnold and Jimmy Chin, for you mountaineering or alpinist people out there. And they kind of approach organizational resilience from a mountain climbing perspective. I think it's a different vantage point that people don't often think about when it comes to what organizational resilience can mean and what those interactions with our counterparts can really mean. I think that oftentimes we think about it, it's a very standard operating procedure. It's very process driven. It's very, this is what we do. This is what the playbook has told me to do. And they kind of approach it from a different vantage point. Are there benefits from or benefits to making an organization more flat when a crisis arrives. And I think that they do a great job of kind of selling that. And I would tend to agree with them, right? When the crisis happens, I probably need to flatten out my organization a little bit, right? I can't have people waiting on decisions just because we haven't empowered them to make the decisions themselves. If I have done the legwork previous to this, I should be able to empower those people to make that decision and limit that disruption themselves. And I think that this does a great story of kind of reframing that in that type of approach.
Wonderful.
And I just
That's
put it in the
the
chat. I think everyone can see that. At least I hope they can. Maybe it's maybe Bob can share it afterward.
Yes, you can see it in the chat. I'll also include it in the
Perfect.
follow-up email for everyone's convenience. So that is the
Thank you,
final question here we have today. So any parting words here today, Sean?
No, I just want to say thank you for everyone for attending and for DRJ for sponsoring this. I enjoy putting these things together and sharing this information that we've learned through talking with a variety of customers and industry leaders. I look forward to doing another one of these in roughly a month or so. So hopefully we'll see you guys back then.
All right, wonderful. Thanks again, everyone, for your attendance here today. We again hope you gather some great information from today's webinar. I'd like to personally thank Sean for his time here today, as well as Everbridge for sponsoring today's webinar. Again, we will be emailing everyone a link to the recording. You may view that recording as frequently as you wish or share it with your peers. If you have any additional questions, please contact Disaster Recovery Journal. Thank you again, and this now ends today's webinar. Thanks, Sean. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Bob.